people and ruled by the ideals of the Enlightenment, that knowledge should be dispersed to everyone. It shouldn't be contained by only a few. Of course, this is an ideal. As we all know, the intentions can be good, but they don't always happen the way that it's intended. And so these revolutions, imagine you're in France and you've stormed the king's palace, you have usurped him, and you have a palace full of art, full of stuff, all of these cabinets of curiosities, all of these collections. Well, what do you do with them? Well, you flip it on its head. You turn it now into public art. The king owned it, but now the public owns it. And so this is the birth of the modern museum, of that it serves the nation. It is public engagement. Everyone owns this, not just the government. But it does serve as an arm of the government, right? And it does legitimate the power and prestige of that nation. Like I said, there's a lot of nationalism when you go, say, to the Louvre. I mean, if you listen to how the Louvre talks and organizes its space, you think that French art is the logical successor of, say, Greek art and Roman art, right? So the way that they display things still showcases and legitimizes the power of the government and the culture and its people. And so on one hand, museums they carry on that connotation of high cultural ideas and beliefs, right? So it's still associated with this kind of elite mentality of I need to educate, which is that is coming from a point of privilege, right? That we as a museum know better than our audiences, so we have to instruct them. And so there is this idea that there is an ideal citizen in mind, right? In this early model, to be specifically clear, there is an ideal citizen, and a well-rounded, educated citizen. And very interestingly, for social reformers during the Enlightenment, thinking about what to do with these public museums now, they really wanted upper class norms to diffuse into the quote unquote lower subordinate masses that they thought didn't have as much decorum, and weren't as ideal citizens as, say, the upper class, right? And so they did this through the mind, through education, but they also did it by how you interact with art. How do you actually behave in a museum? I'm thinking about with you guys a question. If you've ever been to a museum, do you react differently? Are you quiet? Are you calm? You don't run around? Are you very silent? Maybe you sit and contemplate things. And that is, if you do, which is very typical in an art museum, as well as like a library or a reading room. These are disciplined behaviors that are meant to say this is what the ideal citizen reacts when confronted with knowledge and education, right? That you need to be this calm receptacle for it. It needs to just go into you, and you need to be very alert, but also very calm. And so on one hand, it's disciplining this ideal Enlightenment citizen, but also if we're thinking about museums as public engagement, publics are very diverse. They were also this kind of sense of creating very calm, educated people was thought to, well, we're going to actually maybe decrease violence and riots if people come to the museum and they get educated in history and in art. But also think that it will take them away from what was considered socially unproductive activities, like going to the pub, going to the tavern, going to the brothel, right? So remember, we're talking about the 17 and 1800s. And so instead of, the urge to go to the tavern and, get drunk, maybe get in a fight, whatever, that if you go to a museum, that won't happen, and you will leave educated and a much more ideal citizen for the country. And so not only do art museums present are symbols of power for a nation and exert a lot of authority to audiences, it also outlined a way of displaying these objects, right? It's not like these cabinet of curiosities where it's just haphazardly strewn about on walls. No, museum exhibitions are very, very highly curated. That's why we have curators. These are individuals whose job are to organize objects in very specific ways that convey very specific meanings, right? And so you can see any museum exhibition is always going to be performative. Someone made the choice to put that object next to that object and next to that object, and to create a general theme and narrative that they want you to subliminally see and understand. And when we're talking about a very traditional view of the museum, and that's what I'm talking about today, just this very traditional idea of the museum, um, this narrative often reflected the accepted norms of a society, right? That it goes back to that ideal citizen, but it's also what is the ideal society? What is our ideal society? And so we see very specific or categorizing of class, gender, sexuality, race, nationality, right, in these traditional museum spaces, that we don't see a lot of gray area. There's the norms of the society are reflected in how exhibitions and objects are displayed. And that's this principle of display that I'm talking about. But let's get to let's problematize that a bit, right? Which hopefully you see where that can, museums can get into trouble with that, right? You're presuming an ideal visitor but you want them to ingest an ideal narrative about identity, about history. So what becomes visible to visitors in a museum, right? There's always some object, there's always something that wasn't displayed instead, right? So other types of representations, other narratives are actively excluded in this process. And this goes to what I was talking about, how this traditional way of categorizing and displaying, this principle of display, is always at odds with the goal of a more open-minded space that wants to have different representations, because there's always going to be exclusions, right? You have to make practical choices in an exhibition. You can't display everything, but the process in and of itself is exclusionary, right? There's always going to be something hidden in the permanent collection that might refute what the curator wants audiences to see, right? Other narratives that might make audiences question what the curator wants to say. And so in other words, what is chosen for view and how they are placed together construct a sense of value that requires an opposite, right? The invaluable, the unseen, the absent, right? And this is an open-ended question for you guys. It's open-ended still for museums. How do museums deal with this fact? How can they change museum practices to not undervalue the things that they can't display and the narratives they can't talk about? Because you can't talk about all narratives at once. You have to make specific choices. Okay, so that's museum and power. Let's look at some more fun images. This is an aerial view of the Louvre Museum, and great example of a general survey museum. It's absolutely massive. You cannot do it in a day. And it has objects from all around the world. So objects that accumulated from the history of colonialism in France, the monarchy's collection, and that was the seed of the Louvre. The Louvre itself was actually one of the king's palaces that got turned into this public space, and the princely collection was turned into the public collection. but then we have other types of museums that weren't necessarily former palaces of deposed kings, but new builds for the time in the 1800s as places to hold collections that were donated by wealthy people, right? Because we're getting into this idea that, people need to see art. So if you are wealthy and you have a collection, you give it to a museum, and that's an act of kind of charity or benefacting the general populace. And so the British Museum, architect Robert Smirke, this is the South Portico of the British Museum, constructed 1846 to 1847, has a very, very specific architecture. And if you've been to maybe the Metropolitan in New York City or in other museums in the US as well, you notice that, wow, there's a lot of Greek and Roman influence to a lot of these museums that were built around the same time. And that has a lot of meaning because it is a harkening back to Greek and Roman antiquity as a display of power, right? Very powerful civilizations that, if we're thinking about Enlightenment thinking, they were looking back to antiquity as, the sources of knowledge. That, knowledge was very much part of the philosophies during these times, proliferation of culture and art. And so by recreating these designs for your architecture, so for instance, we have our Ionian columns. We have columns. We have, an architecture that actually looks very much like a Greek or Roman temple. It's a sign of authority, so it makes sense. Also, the same thing happens with capitals. So the Washington D.C. There's a lot of architecture inspired by classical structures because it symbolizes power, culture, prestige. But what happens inside these museums, right? So now we're getting into, how do museums organize? They can't be cabinets of curiosity. They have much loftier goals. They're there to not only symbolize a nation, educate a ideal populace, they also have to figure out how to fit objects from all around the world into a narrative, a history, a timeline. And one key thing these collections share, and all of these museums that came about in the Enlightenment, was the scheme of a linear didactic layout dedicated to narratives of development or progress. And this is important, right? So linear meaning that, there's only one timeline, right? This isn't many timelines. This isn't string theory coming together. That there is a solid history of art. It is solid, it is unchanging, and it is authoritative. Didactic means instructional. It means educational. So this timeline is meant to be easily seen and understood by an audience member. And so exhibition spaces, rooms, where, what you have, your Greek room, you have your Roman room, you have your ancient Egyptian room. Everything is organized by chronology so that you see changes, right? This is very typical for, survey museums, even today. Everything is categorized, but it's categorized in a way where you get a sense that we start in antiquity, say Mesopotamia, right? Which are very, and then we have ancient Egypt, and we get a sense that art is just developing and progressing. It's getting better, more sophisticated, and whoa, it just jumps right into Greek art and Roman art, and then we get into primarily European art. So you get a sense that this didactic linear narrative is making European art kind of the best. This is the full fulfillment of what art and the visual world was ending at, right? What the Egyptians were doing was meant to culminate in what Europe is doing. And so we start to see that exclusionary view, right? You're creating the sense of power, the power of Europe within the history of art and the history of collecting. But what about other objects from other places around the world? What about Africa? What about South America? The Australia, the Pacific Islands, right? They're all artifacts from these cultures are also part of these collections. So where do you put them in this timeline? Well, a lot of inspiration was taken from another type of event that was happening in the 1800s, and that was these expositions. And maybe you've heard of the famous Great Chicago exhibition where we had our H.H. Holmes, the very one of the early serial killers in American history, took his victims. But what these expositions did is they had goods from all around the world, and they would display them by divided by geography, so nations and colonies and technologies. And similarly, there was this idea that the Western world and the inventions in the West were much more developed or progressive than anywhere else. And often objects from other places, say, from Africa, from Oceania, which is, the area around Papua New Guinea, that they were, quote unquote, with lots of air quotes, exotic again. That they were meant to be spectacles of, oh wow, look at this inferior art to this time, right? And so you are using other cultures that are not in Europe as that inferior, as the absent, as something that you can judge yourself against to make yourself seem more progressive or modern. And this is something that these exhibitions did. People came to look at artworks outside of Europe as very much like these cabinets of curiosities, right? But it wasn't meant to deepen the knowledge. It was really just meant to make yourself feel better about your art and your museums and your technology. And so that's the exposition. And so museums very much did the same thing. And one of the things that they did was split art from natural history, right? This is one of the things that it does. You don't see, in a typical art museum, you do not see specimens, right? We have two different institutions for that. And so on our left, we have a view of just a random view from inside the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, a very typical survey museum of only modern art. But then you have the view of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City as well, and very different in how it displays objects, what type of objects, and so art museums have to detach themselves from that type of material history. In the expositions, they would have all been together, right? And to further organize the space of the new modern museum was the invention that is called the white cube, and that's a key word. The white cube refers to the common practice of having a gallery be very minimal, white walls, a floor that is usually wood or something not gonna catch your attention, and then you display your objects one by one, side by side. And this type of display, principle of display, was fully exploited at MoMA in New York in the 1930s under the direction of Alfred H. Barr, museum director, but also he was an art historian himself. And the goal of the white cube was to minimize visual distractions. And in doing so, Barr hoped to direct viewers towards what he saw as a pure experience of the work of art. That if you are distracted, you are not fully absorbing the impact of what the art is doing in and of itself visually, but what the exhibition is doing, the narrative that's being created by this linear didactic setup. The bare spaces, white walls, and minimalist frames he used are now so common. This practice is so common that you probably hardly notice. You probably have seen it over and over again, and never once said like, why are they displaying it like this? It has become essential to how museums display artworks even today. But there are problems with this, right? This is a manifestation of that idea of creating a single narrative directed by a curator that is creating a narrative for an audience that we are asked to engage with and accept and to value. This is a very imposing space. The white cube makes you think that, wow, this must be important to be displayed like this. Well, there are problems, right? Because there's the questions about power and authority, right? Those who control art, be it museum directors, curators, staff, they control how its form, its placement, its availability, right? There's so much in permanent storage that sometimes never gets displayed at all. It just lives in permanent storage forever in shadow and dust. And also definitions, right? Defining what is valuable, defining the narrative. And that is very powerful. And this is one of the things that we need to think about this week with museums. How can museums improve upon this particular principle of display? Not all museums want to move away from it, but maybe they want to be more inclusive or do things a bit differently that doesn't pit European art against the world, right? And this image that you're seeing here is an example of this. Going back to what I was talking about where is African art, where is South American art in this narrative? Well, usually they're put on the outskirts. They're just clumped together in rooms with no narrative connection to what's going on in the other galleries. And so you get a sense that there's something other, right, quote unquote, that the museum space itself is putting this narrative of, well, okay, you can go in here and it's interesting, like a cabinet of curiosities, but it really has nothing to do with the other art, which is so much more important, that we give this wonderful cultural narrative to. And so many critics of this model see the, putting just, art from other places in these rooms that are very far away, not very accessible, as just a continuation of that early colonialism we talked about, that collecting just stuff that you took from places around the world, and that it still exists, right? And that how can we change this model? And here's the question that I'm going to leave you with today is, who should control this? How can museums change? Should this control rest with curators and scholars, that they need to do better, be better, change the institution from within? Or should these professionals pay more attention to the audience and what the audience thinks and what they are engaged with, and maybe their experience with artworks, and not focusing so much on this grand narrative? This is an open-ended question for you guys, and I hope this is fascinating. This conversation will continue in our other episodes for this week, as we think about how museums are changing and how they want to change this history.